have two very able pinch hitters, Drs. Ozonof and Sherman, but neither of whom are immunologists, and neither of whom they've asked me to remind you have not prepared papers and don't feel especially expert in this area, so I need to warn you and bear with them on this. So we had a presenter who was prepared on it. By way of introduction, let me just say that I have worked in my work with a bunch of immunologists, and I think immunology poses a sort of particular kind of problem, which is it's an area which tremendously interests people. It's an area which there's a lot of reinforcement for, both in the media, everything from people's sense, people want to argue that they have chemical AIDS. It sounds like an attractive idea. A few years ago, National Geographic ran a big story about it. I think there's a general sense that immunology is a field that's growing tremendously. On the other hand, and there was a time, there was a burst, I think I heard this yesterday, there was the burst of more sophisticated testing. And a lot of us did immunological testing on various people who were exposed to chemicals. And I think at this point, as promising all that is, there are a lot of very interesting questions. I have been in this very city and had the defendants, one of their great immunologists who will always be called of interest, stays here, Dr. Salvaggio. And I think there's a lot of troubling questions. I don't think the immunological evidence is as clear and as easy as some of us would like it to be or think that it really is. There are any number of studies that have been done on our side which people measure A, B, C, and D, but they don't stand up, quite honestly, to much scientific rigor. And in the 3 or 4 cases which I've done, I need to tell you by way of a very conservative approach that when you read the defendants' immunological depositions, their experts belittle our evidence, you have to take it reasonably seriously. I think that the evidence is at this point early on and pretty confusing, and for those of you that think that there's sort of an immunological test and it's really going to prove everything that's easy, I want to just add that word of caution before we start. I don't know who's agreed to be first. David has.
The changes in immunology that have occurred over the last 10 years have been absolutely monumental. They're really traceable to 2 things. One of them is the development of new technologies in biology, particularly new techniques in molecular biology, monoclonal antibody techniques, particularly in genetic engineering or recombinant DNA techniques. So that's one element in this that's presented an explosion of knowledge. The other is the AIDS epidemic, as you know, which involves the entire immune system, and it is because of the urgent interest in that epidemic that has stimulated absolutely an astounding amount of research work applying these new techniques and tools to this very serious public health problem, and resulted in lots of new techniques, new tools, new diagnostic codes, and so forth. And it was inevitable, I think, that those techniques should be applied in the area of toxic exposures. There are some interesting, I think, clues or reasons why we should be looking in the area of the immune system and toxic exposures. One of them is that many of these chemicals are neurotoxins, and as Dr. Sherman and ably demonstrated yesterday, and there is seems to be a fairly close connection between the nervous system and the immune system. The lymphokines and the neurotransmitters, for example, seem to have similarities. There are cell surface properties of cells in the nervous system that are the same as cells in the immune system. And agents that hit one system often will hit the other. The AIDS virus being an extremely good example of that. The 2 main systems that the AIDS virus affects are the immune system and the nervous system. Other chemicals like chloridane affects the nervous system and the blood system. And there is now some evidence of immune irregularities with chloridane as well. So it was a natural thing to look just on the basis of biological plausibility at chemical effects on the immune system, especially since many of the complaints that people have were exposed to toxic chemicals in a way are explainable by an effect on the immune system or the nervous system. Both of these systems have 2 interesting properties. They are, when you disturb them, you can have sort of pan-symptom effects, or effects on many different organ systems. many different manifestations. I don't remember what the other one was. I'll remember it in a minute. I'm so well organized, I have an outline in my head, and then I forget the outline. So it did make sense to look at the immune system. And we, as well as other groups, have done so. One of the places we looked at it was in Woburn, Massachusetts. Could somebody put on the slide projector? What's an academic without a slide? Somebody who has nothing to say. One reason we were interested in looking at immune effects had to do with one of the issues that I raised in the general session, and that is that with low prevalence conditions, rare conditions, you have low statistical power. That is, you have not very much ability to pick up health effects that are actually there. So what we were searching around for is not the tip of the iceberg, but the body of the iceberg, to go and look at higher prevalence conditions that may or may not go on to more serious disease. And one of the places we've looked, not the only place, is in immunotoxicology, especially T-cell studies. In using a test on a population, for example, an epidemiological study, these are some of the desirable properties. It should be a reliable technique. That is to say, when you do it the same thing again under the same conditions to the same person, you should come up with the same answer. It should be a valid technique, at least in the sense that you know what the parameters of it are. Its sensitivity and specificity should be known. That is, how many false positives and how many false negatives you get. It should be available, one that's done only in one laboratory, in Boston or New York City, and not available to anybody else just because of very much use. It should be affordable. If it costs $20,000 per test, it's not very feasible. And it should be acceptable. Brain biopsies and liver biopsies are probably not going to be very good, although they might yield a lot of useful information. Even things like 24-hour urines are difficult to do on large populations. Being tied to a bottle for 24 hours is not exactly great. And even things that are relatively simple may not be acceptable for other reasons. You can go into a shopping center and take blood pressures, even take blood samples, but it's difficult to do rectal exam. And these things are actually, it turns out to be important, that it's got to be something that somehow is acceptable. Even a stool sample, people will give you urine samples much more readily than they'll give you a stool sample, although presumably they have both available. So we decided to do some T-cell studies on family members of the Woburn population. We were going to look at the cell surface antigens, T-cell markers, and there you've got some choices. There are different kind of cell surface antigens that you can use. The OK series, the Loop series, there's one other series. These different series are correlated, or they represent the reagents of drug companies. The reagents that you use to detect the antigens have different names to them, and they probably detect slightly different cell surface antigens. They seem to be very highly correlated with each other, but it's not completely clear that they're recognizing exactly the same epitopes. So we went ahead and did those cell surface markers. Also wanted to look at natural killer cell markers. Natural killer cells are cells in the immune system that are thought to be involved in the elimination of tumor cells. And if you have an effect on them, it's thought that you might be more susceptible to development of clinical cancer. Blastogenesis, which really is a measure of cell turnover in the white cells, and the functional activity of natural killer cells. Now, here we decided, gee, it'd be a good idea to look at these kinds of things. And the first thing that we discovered was that we didn't know what a normal value for them was. Now, because of the AIDS epidemic, lots of people have been doing clinical tests of AIDS patients and non-AIDS patients using these things. And the question is, what do they use for normal reference mark values? Well, we went and looked in the literature, and as an epidemiologist, I have to say I was horrified by what I saw. what I found was that everybody used what are called laboratory controls. A laboratory control is the the 6 medical students who are hanging around the cafeteria on the day that you went through the experiment. The 7 employees in your laboratory, all of them exposed to solvents and the virus that you're working with, everything else, a much more homogeneous economic groups and so forth. And we went through close to 100 papers looking for suitable reference values, and we were not able to find a reference group that we thought was correct, so we decided that we would establish our own reference group and picked a random sample of the population and determine what their values were to compare the Woburn families with them. And so we went ahead to do an area probability sample. I want to show you this not because it's immunotoxicology, but to suggest to you the kinds of problems that you're going to begin to encounter when you actually try and apply a technique like this to this area. Apply it in a way that is not going to be vulnerable or as vulnerable to criticism. And we wanted to really make this one bulletproof because the Woburn case was a very high stakes case, and we just didn't, we wanted to always go the extra mile. So here was our reference group. We took the entire Boston area, which is about 3 million people. That's the SMSA, that stands for Standard Metropolitan Statistical Area, and it's, in other words, the greater Boston area. We divided it up into 5 geographic regions, 4 corners in the center. We listed the census tract in each area, and then in each census tract, we made a list of the blocks. And by using the block enumeration from each of the 5 lists, we divided up into 5 areas so we could get representation from every portion of the SMSA. We looked at the size of the blocks in the 1980 census block enumeration to give us a rough estimate of how many people there were. And by knowing from statistical considerations how many people we wanted to wind up with, which was about somewhere between 40 and 50, we knew that as we made this gigantic consolidated list of blocks in this area, that in order to, if we had a sample, let's say 1 in 10,000 people, that in order to get to somewhere around the 10,000th person, we had to go so far down the list to the 180th block, let's say. I'm just making these numbers up. Once we found that block and made a list of all of those blocks, then that's where the fun starts. Then you have to send field personnel out to those blocks to make a list of the addresses. And the reason is that there is no list of addresses for blocks in a city. There are, some of you may know that there are voting lists and town censuses and things like that in various places, but they're usually not complete. There's in-law apartments in the back and tenants on the 2nd floor and vacant housing. And if you want to pick a real sample, you've got to have the list that you pick the sample from to begin with. So we sent people out with clipboards and had them, look at mailboxes and actually copy down addresses and make the list. And then we randomly selected households from the chosen block, sent letters to the household explaining the study, and a field interviewer then visited the household and determined the number of eligible adults in the household. I'll show you what an eligible adult was on the next slide. Now, the number of adults in Woburn was 22. The number of people in the control group is roughly twice that, so we're looking between 40 or 50 people in the control group. So these are not big numbers we're dealing with, but it's big problems that we're dealing with. When you go to, if you know that a particular household is involved, and you know that you want an adult over the age of 18 in that household, that's not the end of the story. You go and knock on the door of that household, you just can't take the person who answers the door, right? Because there might be a bias associated with that. And home when you go and knock on doors. So the first thing you do is you find out how many eligible adults there are in the household. You look at a random number table on your clipboard and you say, I'm going to take the 3rd oldest or the 2nd oldest, whatever it happens to be. Right? And if that's not the person that's talking to you and that's home, that's tough luck for you. You got to keep coming back until the one that you randomly selected is the one that's there, and there are no substitutions. If they say that person is away at college, or that person works nights, or whatever, then you just got to keep, either you get a non-response from it, or you've got to keep coming back until you find that individual. That's selection through the use of a Kish table. Kish was the man who developed this procedure. Then when you finally get a hold of that person, you interview the respondent. We collected a lot of the same kind of information that we showed you before in the Zolresm study. And if the person is eligible, we ask the person to donate blood. And we offered to pay the person $50 for doing so. We felt it was necessary to offer some incentive. Somebody came and knocked on your door and said, "Can we take some blood from you?" I don't know, some of you are probably public-spirited citizens, but we didn't feel that it would be all that fruitful. We then, and we got good response rates, about 70% of the people agreed to do so. Then the blood was drawn and coded with a 3-digit number, and it was then, and this was always done on the same day of the week, either a Monday or Friday, 6 in the morning and 12 noon. That's because lymphocyte values change throughout the day, so we wanted to keep that constant. On the same days, we also took blood from the Woburn families, 1 or 2 each time, and mixed them in with 3-digit code in there and sent them all mixed together to the laboratory, who had no idea who was a member of the Woburn family and who was one of the control groups. Only after the analysis done, after the blood was analyzed, was the code broken, so that we could divide it into the family members and the control group. And this turned out to be a very effective way to do this for legal reasons. It was absolutely bulletproof. The defendants who took my deposition on the subject thought that we had used laboratory controls and were all set for that. And I wish that I could somehow engrave in stone the look on their face when I had described our procedure to them. That was the end of that. Now, who are these people? They were residents of the Boston SMSA. They were white because the Woburn residents were all white between the ages of 1850, because the Woburn residents were all between the ages of 1850. They had not been hospitalized in the last year except for childbirth or cosmetic surgery. They were not pregnant, because that has an effect on the immune system, and none of the Woburn folks were pregnant. They had no history of cancer. They were not on steroids or birth control pills, also because of the effects on the immune system. No bleeding disorders, because we didn't want to stick a needle in them and have to place a tourniquet around their arm. And they had never lived in Woburn. And these people were all on the MDC water supply as well, which is one, they were all on the same water supply, different than the Woburn water supply. Now, this slide shows the results. We have actually published the results. I don't have a slide of it, and I didn't know I was going to be given this talk. When I left the house as I was running to the airport, I grabbed these slides, which had been prepared for a different purpose. But we have published this in the journal called Cancer, Immunology, and Immunotherapy. I have just one copy of it here with me. It's called Association Between Clinical Symptoms and Lymphocyte Abnormalities in a Population with Chronic Domestic Exposure to Industrial Solvent-Contaminated Domestic Water Supply and a High Incidence of Leukemia. That's not the abstract, that's the title.
What's the journal again?
It's Cancer, Immunology, and Immunotherapy, volume 27, page 77, 1988. What did we find? Well, we found that first of all, I should say, this was the third time these immunological parameters had been measured on the Woburn folks. They had been measured twice before at Mass General, who also did these determinations. In a very good laboratory, but using laboratory controls. In comparing our population controls with the laboratory controls, we found that there were differences, but they were not significant differences. The measures of central tendency, that is, things like the median and the mode, were pretty much the same, so that, in fact, you could very well have used them. But there was a little bit more spread in our population controls than you find in most laboratory controls, and I think the reason for that is obvious. We had an unselected population. People who are laboratory controls are a highly selected population. So we had larger numbers and a little bit more spread than the Woburn folks did. We also discovered that the Woburn, by the time we measured them the third time, there are measures of central tendency. The average values were the same as the population controls, but their distribution was different. There were many more Woburn people in the tails of the distribution, either very high or very low, than you would expect from chance alone using a Fisher exact test. And there are other ways to display the differences. One of them is with cumulative distributions that's done in this paper. And one of the things that we discovered when we did that was that whereas the first two tests were abnormal, the third test, as it evolved through time, was normal. We were seeing a changing lymphocyte picture in the Woburn population, including unstable T4, T8 ratios, which is fairly uncommon. People may have different T4 values and different T8 values from each other, but their T4, T8 ratio is usually relatively constant through time, and these folks have changed through time. Remember, these were people who were being measured 6 or 7 years after cessation of exposure. And they also had neurological abnormalities, which were well documented. That's also been published in the literature by Bob Feldman in the archives of environmental health earlier this year, I think it was. So that's one thing. We also, although it's not recorded in this paper, saw very significant differences in blastogenesis cells. That is, the white cells of the Woburn families were turning over 50% faster than that of the controls. And that was provocative and worrisome in the face of the fact that these were people in an area coming from a leukemia cluster. And of course, with leukemia, you see exactly the same thing. None of the Woburn families were leukemics. Family members were leukemics, but they were family members of leukemics. So the results here are tantalizing. In some respects, we know what to make of them, especially in the context of the leukemia cluster here. But in general, we've now done these immune studies in other places. What Ron says is absolutely true. We are seeing differences, but we're not exactly sure what the differences mean. And I think that the use of these immune techniques may be helpful in certain circumstances, but it has to be used with a great deal of caution and with a great deal of care. I've tried to show you here some of the care that we tried to take in doing this kind of a study, and I think if you're going to use it in a legal setting, you have to be prepared to dot every I and cross every T without exception. We did things, as a matter of fact, that I would never do under normal scientific circumstances. All the data we put up on a spreadsheet, for example, and then the lawyers went over the spreadsheet and they looked for differences and discrepancies in the fourth digit after the decimal point. Those are entirely meaningless from a scientific point of view. Some of them were round-off errors. But from a legal point of view, they're fodder for cross-examination. Right? So, what's this discrepancy? Why is this number different than this number doctrine? So there's a certain amount of inefficiency involved in that kind of inefficiency in that regard. On the other hand, I find that litigation is one of the very nicest settings in which to do science because there is no peer review process that I'm aware of, and I do a lot of peer review, that is as rigorous as wondering what's going to happen to you on cross-examination and anticipating that kind of stuff. The care that you take and really thinking through the problem to the last extreme was sort of a nice scientific experience for me. I kind of liked it. And I think that maybe if a lot of our so-called peer review science were done with the same care as science that's done in litigation is, that we would have better science overall. I'm going to now turn the podium over to Dr. Sherman, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about these immunotoxicity from her point of view. And then I guess either one of us would be happy to answer questions about it.
I feel right now like somebody said to me that I want to play tennis with Christopher. I flunked tennis in college, and following David's absolutely elegant presentation is a little awe-inspiring. My experience is quite different than his in that I have not had the privilege of working with a major laboratory where my research can be funded, but mostly in the context of medical legal work. And I appreciate what David said about dotting the I's and crossing the T's, in that most of my work is involved in doing what's called state of the art. In other words, covering the literature and covering things that have been written about immunological cancer, neurological findings. My own experience is strictly clinical and examining patients. And over the course of the last 18 years, I've examined about 8,000 workers who've been exposed to a variety of different chemicals. And my experience has been, early on, when I was seeing people who had asbestos-related disease, we were taught in medical school when you get very, very severe lung disease, you get a compensatory increase in the red cells. Well, I was not seeing that. I was seeing anemia in these people, and then later on found realized that the sharp asbestotic fibers were irritating the lungs and causing bleeding. These people were developing anemia, but they were also developing immunological abnormalities. This has also been described in the literature in people who were silicotics. The other group of people that I see most with immunological abnormalities are those who work with plastics and paints. When you think about it, the chemicals that are used to make plastics, such as acrylics, epichlorohydrin, vinyl, are double bonded chemicals, which are useful because they make polymers. But these also can double bond to the tissues of the body, into the DNA, and cause immunological abnormalities. It was mentioned that the irritation, for instance, formaldehyde results in chronic increase in cell turnover. And with the increase in cell turnover, we're also seeing metaplasia and then malignancy. Specific cases that I'm aware of and that I've seen are, for instance, we've heard about meat wrappers asthma. That has nothing to do with meat. It had to do with the people who were wrapping meat in vinyl chloride plastic and then cutting it with a hot wire, which of course is still done in the supermarket. The first case of meat wrappers asthma I saw was a woman who was wrapping t-shirts in plastic. And she had full-blown systemic lupus erythematosus, which she had gotten within about a year and a half of starting to work in this t-shirt wrapping factory. A lot of literature about exposure to solvents, vinyl chloride, plastics, and the development of scleroderma and lupus and a variety of immunological abnormalities. Now, my associate from Detroit was here at the AAFP meeting, and he went to all the pop stands that the manufacturers were displaying, and one of the things he discovered, do you have it with you?
I'm worried.
I was afraid of, were these contraceptive sponges, and he kept saying and he said he kept saying to me, it's like, saying to the drug pusher, what kind of plastic is that? And they said, oh, don't worry about a thing, you know. Well, good question. What kind of plastic was it? He asked. He's waiting now to get the material safety data sheet and find out what kind of plastic it is that the drug company is asking women to put in contact with their mucosal skin.
Their response was, it's polyurethane. They use it in heart valves.
I'm not going to talk very long, as I don't want to start coughing again. But I am seeing immunological abnormalities in the people who've been exposed to chlordane, and we saw that in the PBB exposed population in Michigan, and also in the PCB people that I have examined. I just would make you aware that if you're examining patients or working with patients exposed to solvents and plastics, that immunological abnormalities should be high on the list, along with neurological, carcinogenic, teratogenic, mutagenic effects. And I want to drop one little hot thing in your lap and let you think about it. It's been pointed out that blood stored in plastic bags may be showing some chromosomal changes as a result of the plasticizers leaching into the blood and interacting with still some of the live cells. Think about that next time you see somebody get a transfusion. I don't know if it should be stopped or not. I think it ought to, but I don't have any data on it. You want any questions?
What have you destroyed?
ahead.
Hi, I just had a question. Most of the petrochemical plants we represent workers, I work for the oil chemical and accounting workers, have blood drives. And we found in certain circumstances, in fact, Ken Miller's been investigating one here in Louisiana, elevated levels of hexachlorobenzene in workers' blood. Levels that are alarmingly high. I think these people, their blood would be classified as hazardous waste if you had to throw it out of the landfill. Unfortunately, it's running through their veins. The question is, when those blood drives are taken, and then that blood goes into the
A sick
blood
person.
bank, and then becomes used for transfusions, what kind of immunotoxic effects can we anticipate, et cetera?
I'll let you answer that.
Well,
What kind of screening is going on for workers who give blood who've been exposed to toxins? So that, when, we're concerned about AIDS in the blood supply, are we also adding some sort of chemically induced, immunotoxin into the blood supply?
Well, that's an interesting new piece of information. I don't know if anybody is screening these blood samples and what we can anticipate. I certainly think if you're the person who's in critical condition laying there on the table and getting the IV, you're wondering what kind of things you're getting. I think it's very interesting. My own personal bias is that blood ought not to be stored in plastic containers. And obviously, maybe one of the things we should be screening for is doing screening for chemicals on blood samples along with AIDS and the other testing.
You're talking about the plastic going into blood in containers. Now, the thing that comes up, and you mentioned this, or somebody mentioned this yesterday, what about the containers where food are stored? The thing that comes to mind is something like a vinegar or a highly spiced item like mustard, oil. I mean, does that affect us?
I think it probably does. I recommend that anybody buying salad oil not buy it in a plastic bottle. Plasticizers are soluble. The phthalate esters that are used in making bendable plastics do leach out into oil.
Yeah, of course, that's not the only place you're exposed to them. That wonderful new car smell? That's mainly phthalates and plasticizers in the inside of the car. It makes you feel so proud.
Well, the film
Pride is probably a health effect from hazardous waste.
the film that forms on the inside of your automobile is the phthalate ester.
When you talked about Dr. The problem that you had with your sample and you wanted to go your comparison sample and you wanted to go out and get it from the have you ever written a paper or do you know of anybody that's published this problem that when you need a comparison sample, they just get the students or something like that?
You mean, has anybody called attention? The question is, has anybody called attention to the fact that the only control values are laboratory controls? Somebody's nodding their head back
Yeah,
there.
there have been quite a few papers written on it. As a matter of fact, addressed the question that came up yesterday on psychometric testing, the control groups there, that's been addressed, challenge in publication also.
I mean, people do talk about the problem of control groups, but I guess the only people I know of who really talked about this much are the clinical laboratory people, most of whose control values are sort of funny controls. Like they often use blood banks, for example. That's also not a randomly selected population. Clearly, people who donate blood are different than the general run of the population. That's a frequent source of normal reference values. A lot of laboratories have their own reference values. So it's kind of a tricky situation, and it probably should be looked at in sort of overall and ask the question, how important is it that the laboratory controls are used rather than random controls? And what makes answering that question more difficult is that very few people have ever done random controls. It's an involved procedure. Why wasn't our study attacked on the basis that we did use random controls? Oh, because clearly it's the best thing to do, right? It's the gold standard to use. It'd be like attacking a study because you didn't use a lousy control group. Yes.
A quick question, I think for Dr. Sherman. Dr. Callender and I have been talking about the taste in food that we have to eat a lot of fast foods. We're talking about the taste from foods heated in the microwave at Time Saver and 7-Eleven and Styrofoam and plastic. It says in large letters, safe for microwave.
I would not eat anything that was heated in plastic in a microwave, because what you're doing is you're volatilizing many of the chemicals that's in the plastic. I mean, I was almost fainted and raised holy hell at the hospital where I was on the staff, because they went from having a kitchen in the hospital to off-site production of food, where they brought it all in trucks and little containers with vinyl chloride plastic wrap over the whole thing, which they then put in the microwave and heated up for the patients. I kept saying, this is crazy, this is unsafe, and I got told to shut up already.
Our last hope, can we use saran wrap?
Well, yeah, I mean, when you're volatilizing all these chemicals into the food, and you can, I mean, if you eat it, you can taste it. Somebody was telling me here, was talking about, they had a Christmas party and they made, I don't know if the ladies here, tell this story, I think it's marvelous.
This was in medical school in New Orleans at LSU. They had, oh, y'all don't need to Anyway, we had a party and they made Long Island iced tea in a huge garbage can about this much, a huge amount of soup. And as the party went on, we were looking down at it and I noticed it was getting darker. They were putting ice in it and it was getting darker. And I said, you know, I've never seen a drink that you add ice to and it gets darker. Right? Something's wrong. So it was leaching something out of the plastic container. Yeah, into like a garbage can thing. But you couldn't stop these people at that point. They were already so they didn't care. Yeah, so here was all the medicine that was drinking all the stuff that came out of the thing. It was the only time I've ever seen that happen, but it was such a huge amount. And probably about 200 troops.
Well, the alcohol would leach the plastics out, and when you put the ice in, it precipitates it.
Yeah.
I drank a lot of stuff in medical school too. It probably explains why most doctors can't cope with the toxic problem. They're missing about 80% of their gray matter.
Explains handwriting signs.
Right. You've got a population exposed to a given level of a chemical. Has anybody done any work to show blastogenesis under that exposure to that chemical is changed?
Not that I'm aware.
Is that a feasible test to do?
Yes, it's a feasible test to do. Blastogenesis studies are not real easy to do. They require specialized laboratories. You have to take lymphocytes, right, culture them with radiated thymidine and harvest them after 5 days and so forth. So,
But I guess I should ask the question, how much of that would stand the rigor of a legal challenge?
well, it depends on what, I guess, what place that piece of evidence had in the case.
Well, let's take any of the chemicals that were in the love canal. If you could show an abnormal blastogenesis on the same level of exposure as they had, how would that fit in?
You mean by incubating the cells in culture with it?
Right, showing
Well,
a decrease in blastogenesis.
I mean, it's, I guess it would be challengeable on a couple of grounds. One of them is you don't know that what happens in vivo is the same thing that happens in the test tube. Right? At least if I were a defense lawyer, I guess that's what I would say. What relevance does it, this doctor, this is just a test tube experiment. Those aren't the conditions in your vein. You know, your body metabolizes these things off, it detoxifies them. But I think it would be a good piece of evidence to have, and if I certainly were doing a case like this, I would love it, and as an expert, I would like to have a piece of evidence like that. I think it would be real helpful. Or to take animals and expose them to try to run blastogenesis studies on that. But those kinds of experiments take time to do, and somebody's got to have the resources to do them, and they just haven't been done yet. There's lots of experiments that one can think of that would be good to do, just have never been done.
Are you doing that, Howard?
Sorry? I'm not doing it at the moment. It's on a drawing board.
Well, let me urge you to do it.
I have two questions. The first one, with your work with the people at Woburn, Massachusetts, I understand they've had the toxic water supply replaced by clean water now. Has any follow-up been done to see if their immune system has recovered at all? I mean, is there any chance of recovery?
We have proposed to do exactly that, not just in the people that we studied, but to take the Woburn community and divide it up into 4 exposure strata based on water modeling, and then do these studies on those 4 strata to look to see if there are any differences. So far, we haven't received support for that, but we're, under active discussion for doing so. It's very expensive to do these kinds of things. To take the kind of care that's necessary to really make this rigorous is expensive. We only use professional survey researchers for this purpose. Well, to do the sampling that I just talked about, get the bloods drawn, not the analyses, right? Just get them to the laboratory was $16,000 to get 47 bloods.
Just one more question. Had you had any experience with an incidence of the chronic fatigue syndrome or chronic Epstein-Barr virus problems with people exposed to TCE or other chemicals?
No, well, the chronic fatigue syndrome has an explicit definition. We never applied those kinds of definitions at the time. It didn't exist in 1983 at the time the Silresin study was done, and we didn't use that kind of definition for chronic fatigue syndrome for these people because it was a different issue. But I can tell you that one common complaint around waste sites is a very unusual and persistent fatigue and tiredness. That is identified by the individuals to be unusual and out of the ordinary, not just a hard day at the office. And the Silresin data I showed, there was a very substantial difference between people who are on the waste side and people in the comparison group. Even though the people in the comparison group, had slightly lower socioeconomic status, perhaps different jobs.
Are either you or Dr. Sherman aware of any study that showed how long it would take a body to recover once they were removed from the exposure?
I'll let Dr. Sherman answer after I'll tell you what I know, which is a lot. Trichloroethylene, the neurological effects of trichloroethylene can be extremely long-lasting. Bob Feldman's got a paper in which he had a trichloroethylene exposure 18.5 years previously and was still able to show nerve conduction defects after a span of almost 20 years. These people had been off the contaminated water supply for 10 years at the time we studied them, and we're still showing neurological and immunological effects from it. It's likely that TCE effects, at least in our view, are very long-lasting. How long-lasting, I don't think anybody knows. Want to comment on that?
Clinically, my experience is that once it has gotten to be involving the motor system where the person feels actually it's clumsy and has difficulty moving, that it doesn't recover. You see some recovery when the complaint is only numbness and tingling. Then I think there's some recovery. But once they get motor involved, is that your experience too? Your neurologist? Once you get motor involved, I don't ever see them get well. Back to normal.
That's typical of axonal neuropathy in general. It's not just about chemical exposure.
Right, once you've taken the insulation off the wire, you don't ever get it back on.
Well,
Yeah, it's not clear if the mechanism here is axonal, but
the demyelin component can to a certain extent recover, and the axonal component is going to be much more slow. As soon as you start involving the motor system, it really doesn't matter about the type or etiology. That you have much slower recovery and often.
Getting those words out of the way, I'm not sure I understood what he just said. But it would not matter what kind of chemical it caused. You said it was trichloroethylene. There was some other chemical that caused this kind of.
It's not chemical specific any more than carcinogens are organ specific. I mean, the chemicals, the various chemicals that could cause neurological damage, whether it's trichloroethylene or perchloroethylene or trichloroethane.
In your immune suppression cases, what sort of clinical picture do you have? Do you have T-cell depression? Or do you have, what are y'all seeing? Do you have pancytopenia, thrombocytopenia?
well, initially,
Leukopenia?
let me separate it into two things. You asked first about the clinical picture and then about the lab evidence. So let me answer them separately. The clinical picture in the Woburn families was a lot like you see around waste studies. It was a lot of dermatologic manifestation, gastrointestinal manifestation, a lot of sinusitis, persistent unremitted sinusitis with positive sinus x-rays, and frequent colds and infections. Now, on the laboratory side, the first test that Mass General did, and this is not a laboratory, this is a laboratory immunopathology that does transplant work and so on. This is not a professional toxics immune person. Showed persistent lymphocytosis in T3s overall and both the T4 and T8 component. When they were looked at sometime later, I have a paper around here somewhere. One of them was returning to normal, either the T4 or the T8, and the other one was still elevated. The third time that we looked at them, both of them had returned to normal as far as the averages went, but the distributions were still different. So it's a complicated mixed picture which seems to be changing dynamically. It changes over time, and I think we are yet to know what the results are. Lymphocytes are relatively long-lived cells, as they could compared to poly, and they can go for months to many years. So it may take some time to wash out abnormal cells or replace them with new ones.
You get a lymphocytosis?
They had initially a lymphocytosis, involving certain segments of the lymphocyte population.
Specifically as to PCE or other chlorinated solvents and the neurological deficits you were talking about, have you been able to develop a feel for threshold issues, either levels or length of exposure?
I now remember one of the things I wanted to say. This is going to be a little bit of a longer answer, but let me say that I want to get to exactly what you asked. One thing that people, especially defense attorneys, but people in general, are often very puzzled about is how people can have health effects with such tiny amounts of chemicals in the parts per billion range, say for carcinogenesis. Well, first of all, let me say for carcinogenesis, parts per billion is a lot of chemical. I mean, Avogadro's number is a real big number, so that even a part per billion means that for 1 part per billion trichloroethylene in a quart of water, you've got 10 to the 14th or 10 to the 15th molecules in it, one with 14 or 15 zeros after. And if any one of those can cause the change in the DNA that leads to initiation of malignant cell, malignant behavior, then it doesn't take very much to do that. But in general, what happens with carcinogenesis, and I'm going to get to the neurological and the immunological in a second by analogy with it, is that it only takes a tiny amount of chemical to cause a very tiny change in one cell, and then the body biologically amplifies that. The original change in the cell is caused, and then the chemical can go away completely. And the cell's replication process, because it's a heritable disorder of that cell, produces 2 cells with that, and then 4, and then 8, until down the line you get the development of a clinical cancer. So what you had is the amplification by the body's own system of the original damage. Now, that's something that carcinogenesis shares with both the immune system and the neurological system. Both of those systems are amplifying systems for very tiny signals. In the case of the immune system, where it has to deal with a microorganism,